the recent past is rough terrain for historians. There are no signposts, no landmarks. You find yourself in a dense thicket of facts and events, unable to see the forest for all the trees. But some things are still clear. Milwaukee has changed enormously in the recent past. Those changes have produced the usual mix of darkness and light, good news and bad. They began with the ferment of the 60s, and they continue today in your lifetime and mine.
Milwaukee was busier than a three-ring circus in the 60s. So much was going on that no one could take it all in at once. But the 60s brought more than struggle and strife. Milwaukee, as always, made time for celebrations. The Great Circus Parade rolled off to its first start in 1963. It was a summertime staple for decades in all its colossal, stupendous, magnificent glory. And there were other reasons to smile. The musical extravaganza called Summerfest made its debut in 1968, only a year after the city was nearly shut down by a riot. Summerfest's lakefront site had been the home of the Midsummer Festival in the 1930s and a Nike anti-aircraft missile battery in the 1950s. Growing with its audience, Summerfest became the largest outdoor music festival in America, drawing as many as 1 million people each year.
How you feel?
Henry Meyer, the father of Summerfest, put the celebration in context. Truly, he said, in these days of struggles against blight, prejudice, and poverty, it is a pleasure to have at least one goal which involves joy. The mayor even wrote a song for the event, the Summerfest Polka.
Rose in Milwaukee, so gay and so free. Milwaukee, 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 a happy place to be.
Milwaukee was a happy place for professional sports as well. The Milwaukee Bucks came to town in 1968. 3 years later, riding the broad shoulders of a young giant named Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, they won the NBA championship. Baseball made a triumphant return in 1970, when the Seattle Pilots became the Milwaukee Brewers. The team seldom left the cellar in its early years, but stars like Robin Yount and Paul Molitor carried the Brewers to an American League pennant in 1982.
Milwaukee had plenty to cheer about after 1970, but there were broader patterns afoot. The ferment of the 60s produced a new perspective on urban life, a new way of looking at the city. Some things had been lost in the rush to the urban fringe, including a sense of history. Milwaukee rediscovered its roots after 1970, and its connection with the past was reborn.
The first sign of change was a new interest in old buildings. In 1968, the grand old Northwestern Railroad depot on the lakefront was demolished. Never again, vowed a group of fledgling preservationists. From that day forward, any threat to Milwaukee's built heritage has been met with stiff resistance. Not every battle ended in victory, including the spectacular Plankinton Mansion, torn down unannounced, early on a weekend morning. But many unique structures have been preserved to delight and inspire future generations. As historic buildings reclaimed their rightful place in the present, there was a renewal of interest in old neighborhoods. Suburban subdivisions, it turned out, weren't for everyone. Some people wanted neighborhoods with a stronger sense of place, a sense of the past, and a sense of community. They found those qualities in venerable neighborhoods like Bayview and Walker's Point, Sherman Park, and Brewers Hill, Harambe, River West, and the Third Ward. At the same time, Milwaukeeans showed new interest in old ethnic traditions. Links to ancestral cultures were re-established with a will after 1970. In the African American community, clothing and hairstyles, art and literature all expressed a reborn sense of connection with the African motherland. In 1978, Milwaukee's Italians held a reunion on the Summerfest grounds near the heart of their old neighborhood and invited the general public. The result was Festa Italiana, Milwaukee's first lakefront ethnic festival. It was a runaway success, and soon other groups followed suit: Mexican, German, Polish, Irish, African American, Indian, Asian, and Arabian. 9 festivals emerged in all, and their combined attendance generally topped the 500,000 mark. The Holiday Folk Fair became the nation's largest indoor multi-ethnic festival, highlighting the culture, cuisine, and costumes of dozens of groups. No city in America could match Milwaukee's celebrations.
Milwaukee already had one of the richest ethnic stews in America, and it just kept getting richer. This used to be South 16th Street. Now it's Cesar Chavez Drive, named for the famous Mexican-American labor leader. Latinos spread south and west from Walker's Point after 1970. The new arrivals came to dominate South Side neighborhoods first settled by Polish immigrants, including my grandparents. They might be surprised to find tortillas in stores that once sold kielbasa.
The same pattern was apparent on the north side. Hundreds of African-American families surged north and west after 1970, following paths blazed by German Milwaukeeans. They found new homes on land that became part of the city in the 1950s. There were new groups as well: Hmong, Laotian, Vietnamese. They became Milwaukee's fastest-growing ethnic groups after 1980. Exiled from war-torn homelands, these Southeast Asians built new lives in a city whose customs and climate could hardly be more different from the worlds they left behind. There has been no shortage of other newcomers. The result was world-class diversity, and Milwaukee celebrated that diversity with unusual spirit. It is through our diversity that we most fully realize our unity as a people.
Milwaukee's unity was too often more theoretical than real. As always, most newcomers settled in the city proper. Older groups, German, Polish, Irish, Italian, were still here by the thousands, but Milwaukee became a majority-minority city in the 1990s. Residents of European background were outnumbered by those with African, Latino, Asian, and Native roots.
The city's human riches did not translate to economic wealth. Milwaukee's minorities, new and old, usually occupied the lower rungs of the economic ladder. More affluent residents continued to sprawl outward into adjacent counties, and the gap between suburban haves and urban have-nots widened alarmingly. The gap was aggravated by an economic crisis. In the early 1980s, a savage recession ripped through America's manufacturing sector. Milwaukee, as a historic stronghold of manufacturing, suffered staggering losses. Alice Chalmers was the greatest casualty. 15,000 workers filled the West Allis complex at its peak, enough to populate a small city. But Alice Chalmers began to bleed red ink in 1981 and finally went bankrupt 6 years later.
When the workers left, factory buildings came down to make way for this strip mall, and the last erecting shop was converted to retail space. An old overhead crane still lingers like a ghost from a vanished time.
Alice Chalmers, unfortunately, was not alone. Schlitz, the beer that made Milwaukee famous, shut down in 1982. Pabst followed, though not until 1996. Miller and a handful of small brewers were left to keep up Milwaukee's reputation as a beer capital. The story was the same everywhere. Between 1979 and 1983, Milwaukee lost more than a quarter of its industrial jobs. Most did not return. African American workers were hit especially hard. After years of struggle, they had finally moved into family-supporting factory jobs. When plants closed, they suffered a disproportionate share of the losses. The result was a sharp increase in African American poverty, even as the larger economy recovered. When the economy finally bounced back, it was obvious that manufacturing was no longer the only game in town. New leaders made Milwaukee a national center for commercial printing, medical imaging equipment, temporary help, department stores, and data processing for banks. Some old giants continued to prosper, and manufacturing remained vitally important. Traditional companies embraced new technologies, and some old-line metal benders roared to new heights in a new century.
Perhaps the clearest sign of Milwaukee's shift is here on the south side. This building was once the home of the Heil Company, a leading manufacturer of truck bodies. When Heil moved to Tennessee, Aurora Healthcare opened its headquarters here. Aurora has since replaced Allis-Chalmers as the region's largest private employer. Milwaukee's economy remains diverse, but the shift from manufacturing to service jobs is unmistakable.
Change was just as dramatic in the political arena. At City Hall, the Henry Meier era came to an end in 1988, after 28 years. Meier's successor was John Norquist, a Presbyterian minister's son. Norquist soon established himself as a fiscal conservative in the old Milwaukee tradition. But the mayor also showed an intense interest in urban design. He encouraged the development of a pedestrian-friendly, visually interesting city. Norquist's influence waned after he admitted an affair with a female staff member. The mayor stepped down in 2004, after nearly 16 years in office. Voters chose Tom Barrett, a former congressman, to succeed Norquist. The new mayor was an affable, energetic Irishman who helped restore a sense of calm to city politics. Milwaukee County government was considerably more volatile. In 1988, veteran Bill O'Donnell lost the county executive seat to newcomer Dave Schultz. Schultz left after a single term, and he was followed by Tom Ament, another courthouse insider. A flap over unusually generous pension benefits led to Ament's resignation and the recall of several board members. In 2002, voters made Scott Walker the first Republican ever to hold the executive's office.
As the political landscape changed, so did the physical landscape. The heart of the city came alive again, thanks to a renaissance shaped by city, county, and private efforts. That spirit of renewal debuted here at the Grand Avenue Mall, a project of the Meier era.
The mall, known today as the Shops of Grand Avenue, opened with a flourish in 1982, and it became the catalyst for well over $1 billion in new development. Water Street blossomed as a center of nightlife. A theater district took shape in the shadow of City Hall. The historic Third Ward sprouted new galleries, restaurants, and condominiums. The Midwest Airlines Center gave both Milwaukeeans and convention-goers a new place to gather. The downtown riverfront was reborn. The Park East Freeway corridor was cleared for redevelopment. A striking new bridge opened the Menominee Valley to a future that included recreation as well as industry. Downtown became a place to live again, and the city's center began to feel like a neighborhood for the first time in half a century. Two more landmarks broke new ground: Miller Park and the Art Museum's Calatrava edition. The Art Museum and the ballpark mark a community that, after all these years, is still open to the future, still spreading its wings to tomorrow.
Our journey ends at almost yesterday. We've been traveling through time in this series, following Milwaukee from its first faint stirrings to the complex metropolis of today. There's a vital link between past and present. History tells us how we got here. The story of our past explains the present. and shapes our common future.
From the very beginning, Milwaukee developed a story entirely its own, one that captured all the richness of the larger human drama. It has been a story punctuated by turmoil and tension, but by triumph as well. A story filled with colorful characters, some who took ethical shortcuts, and others who were civic saints. It has been a story of the constant struggle to make a living, and, more important, to make a life. Look into the faces of the ones who came before. Gaze deeply into their eyes, eyes that stare back from the far side of forever. What passes between you? What message do they send from their eternal stillness? We are not so different after all. We are connected, each to each, across the constantly shifting borders of time. We're all in the same family album. The faces change as the pages turn, but it's all one story, the human condition in its endless depth and complexity. And the story continues. We each take our place on the page, linked to a world of infinite possibility, and write with our lives the next chapter.
Production of The Making of Milwaukee is made possible with grants from Greater Milwaukee Foundation, Halbert and Alice Kadish Fund, Paddock Fund, Lidkey Smith Fund, Otto Borchard Family Fund, Catherine and Walter Lindsay Fund, Lined and Harry Bradley Foundation, Keppen Gerlach Foundation, Fay Macbeth Foundation, Northwestern Mutual Foundation, David and Julia Eline Charitable Foundation, We Energies, Joseph and Vera Zilber Foundation, Polybill Foundation, Douglas and Eleanor Seaman Trust, C.G. Schmidt, and by the MPTV Friends.